Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. I'm Suzanne Sherman. I'll be your host here for the next hour on the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. And if you watched the Democrat committee, the Democrat National Party debate last night, you will see that we are on the edge of further tyranny. As we've been saying here for some time, Donald Trump is merely a placeholder. So if you think that we're going to find the solutions we need from a top-down situation, watch part 2 tonight and see where we're headed. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. We have a fan page, CRN. We also broadcast live on YouTube. If you're listening live right now, feel free to join the chat and submit your questions or concerns. We'll air them and discuss them. We have a SoundCloud page as well. Please follow that. You will get notifications for that and YouTube if you subscribe and get the shows that you cannot listen to live. We appreciate all of those of you that make the effort to listen live and to download our shows. I appreciate the feedback. Every once in a while, I'll hear from somebody as we have discussions on Facebook or other forms of social media that will say they really enjoy the show. So apparently, Jeff, if this keeps up, we might be able to count our listeners on 2 hands. What do you think?
Yeah, actually, Radio Code's been really picking up. We've had quite a few listeners there, and I appreciate it because that really is the bulk of our cost right there to run this, because the Radio Code is a little bit expensive. So I really appreciate when people are listening there, and we have a nice crowd there already this morning. Welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here. We have some people listening on YouTube. Join the chat, please.
Yeah, with the glut of podcasts, broadcasters out there, not to mention the mainstream media and the shows on Patriot Channel, Sirius XM all day long that you can listen to. When people take time out of their day to listen to us, that really means a lot, which is why we put the effort in here to bring you stuff that you're not going to hear on other forms of news outlets. Case in point, Jeff, our discussion yesterday on the Blandensburg Cross in Maryland, everybody's hailing this as a victory for First Amendment, religious freedom. And what we talked about here, and you didn't hear others discussing this is absolutely not a victory for any kind of freedom, because once again, we're looking at 9 politically connected lawyers in their black government issued costumes to determine what is going to be appropriate for over 320 million people. We have the opposite of a Republican form, a representative form of government, when we have a panel of lawyers determining social policy in a small community, which is exactly what happened there. You might like the outcome, but the whole procedure and the process stinks to high heaven, no pun intended. If you go to SoundCloud, also, you can hear some of our other shows that we've recorded. Fundamentals of Federalism is one that I do, as well as Case in Point. We've got to get Dave Benner joining us and doing another one of those as well. Liberty Minutes with Greg Junk Von Carpenter, as well as his shows, The Spy Who Loves Liberty, as well as our other shows, the Waking Up Cerberus. So check those out. If you have a little time on the weekend when you have some vacation time or whatever, catch up on some of our shows. I'm getting some really great feedback, so we appreciate that a lot. I didn't watch the debates last night, Jeff. I did hear some of the highlights on my Facebook news feed, and I'm kind of glad I didn't put that time into it. I watched Yellowstone instead. But one thing that really struck me was, I think, the underlying theme, and this sentence should sound familiar, although nobody comes out and says it, really the common thread that all of them have, and not just the Democrats, but the Republicans as well, is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Classic Karl Marx Communist Manifesto. Unless we change things around and educate our kids, get our kids out of the government schools, this is going to be the mantra of future generations. I was talking to somebody about homeschooling yesterday, and I let them know, Karl Marx, I had that taught to me from high school through college. We heard about that all the time. We have a link on my page, SuzanneCSherman.com. You can get it through my Amazon affiliate link. Frederick Bastiat, the law that was written in the 1850s as a refutation, beg your pardon, against Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. We never heard about that in school. We never are taught what the proper role of government is, and why would government schools want to do that? Why would they want to give you the keys to unbind yourself from the chains from which they've surrounded you? I have a story I want to talk about today. I'm going to get into it momentarily about homeschooling on the rise in Utah, as well as some issues of federalism. We have a case right now, United States versus Davis. Fox News is reporting that Gorsuch is siding with liberals while Kavanaugh maintains a staunch conservative role. Well, I also have an article from Mises that I'm going to remind you about. It was from 2005, but it is still prevalent today. It's still very relevant. It's about the intellectual incoherence of conservatism. So we'll be getting into that. Jeff, we've got some amusing stories out from California. Let's start with San Francisco. You're aware of the problems they're all having right now. Homelessness is absolutely out of control. Drug abuse. They have safe injection sites. So that's up to them. If they want to do that, they have safe injection sites. So if you are an addict and you are using intravenous drugs, you can go to a place and get clean needles, inject them safely, and be in a safe place while you go through your experiences. Fine, that's a local decision. The feds have actually said they're going to clamp down on that because it's unsafe. But California, San Francisco in particular, does want their citizens, notwithstanding the fecal matter in the streets and the show where you can sit in a restaurant and watch somebody actually make those fecal matter piles. But California, San Francisco is going to take a tremendous step in resolving its problems by banning the sale of e-cigarettes.
Yes, I noticed that the other day, and I just, I am the type of person, I don't really care if people smoke. People can smoke. You want to smoke cigarettes, smoke them. E-cigarettes, smoke them. It's not my problem. But if you ruin your health, don't expect me to pay for your healthcare expenses. But it's even further than this. They didn't learn from the past. We did prohibition back in the 20s and 30s, and that didn't work out really well. There were, St. Valentine massacre, and we ended up, which law we ended up with after all that, which is blatantly unconstitutional as well, the Firearms Act. So, they didn't learn before. They're just going to create a black market, and it's going to become just like the drug cartels. There's violent people going to be running it. I mean, come on.
Well, you raise so many great points here. The first of which is really personal responsibility. If you're going to indulge in these habits, if you're going to indulge in fast foods and sodas and the other things that are really bad for you, well, be responsible. I remember when the Affordable Care Act was being debated, and somebody from San Rafael, a health worker, was saying, if we don't have this act passed, people out here with drug addictions can't get the help they need. I'm sorry. No, actually, I'm not sorry. That's your problem. It's called personal responsibility. If you're making bad choices, oh, but it's a disease. Sorry, cancer is a disease. This is a bad choice. Like it or not, you have to be personally responsible for it. I was talking also about, I think New York was going to make sex work decriminalized. And somebody said, well, they need to check the women, or they need to check the people that are selling that to make sure that, no, let the buyer beware. This is about personal responsibilities. You want to act like an adult and do these things, be responsible for the consequences thereof. But this is what's interesting also, is we talk about the intellectual inconsistency. And I will say, on both sides of the aisle, California has a secessionist movement out. Yes, California and Cal Exit. They don't want any part of the federal government. Some of it, this sprung as a result of Donald Trump being elected. Our good friend Marcus Ruiz Evans, he's been consistently campaigning for this for about a decade, if not longer. But this is what's funny is City Attorney Dennis Herrera, he co-authors this ordinance, and he celebrated the final vote. This is a decisive step to help prevent another generation of San Francisco children from becoming addicted to nicotine. Again, is that the proper role of a government? The temporary moratorium wouldn't be necessary if the federal government had done its job. So, on one hand, California and San Francisco wants to eschew federal government policies vis-a-vis, say, for instance, their sanctuary city policies. I've discussed what the constitutional solution to immigration is, and I sided with California on this one. But they can't make up their mind. They don't even understand the concept of federalism. What is the proper role of the general government vis-a-vis California and their policies that they want to implement? They could have acted on this a long time ago in and of themselves if this was such a concern to them. It's not the general government's authority to do so. Jeff, you mentioned prohibition. I have an article. You can find it on SuzanneCSherman.com about the prohibition of marijuana, prohibition in plants, what the parchment and plants, what the Prohibition era can teach us about the drug wars. And as you mentioned, Jeff, we have the National Firearms Act, which resulted from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which was a result of all of a sudden a prohibited substance becoming very, very valuable. And what do we get? Organized crime. Organized crime is actually going to bring us into a topic I'm going to get into later in the show with a recent Supreme Court hearing with regards to sentence enhancements when firearms are used for certain crimes. But I just found this interesting because obviously, even from elected officials at every level, they don't understand the concept of federalism as opposed to nationalism, and they want to pick and choose their battles. Well, we don't like the federal government's immigration policy, so we're going to eschew them. But oh my goodness, the FDA failed to act in a manner we wanted them to, so we have to take it upon ourselves. It was always your own responsibility, California. Start acting like the adults you claim to be. Any comments, Jeff?
No, I think that pretty well covers that whole thing. But again, I agree. That's why I brought up first off personal responsibility. If you're going to do these things, take responsibility for your actions and we'll be fine. But don't come to me expect me to pay for it. And again, the government getting involved, here we go. I said it the other day. I'll say it again. You can always see a good Marxist by when the people say there ought to be a law. And well, we got plenty of that.
They're on both sides. Here's another quick example of the schizophrenia. And again, I'm not just picking on California. We see this all the time in many states, including the so-called conservative ones. California, as we know, has very draconian gun laws. And according to the 10th Amendment, it's within their providence to do so. So here's an article. It's from the Fresno Bee, and we saw this coming. This was one of the reasons I left California. Regulations are being proposed by the Department of Justice requiring ammunition buyers. We know now that ammo buyers were going to be subjected to background checks. We knew that. Now they have to have the real ID, the same ID that you need to get on an airplane, again, federally compliant. You have to have the real ID if you want to purchase ammo. Now, I don't believe real ID is required across the board in California because I know that they are giving people that are here, the illegal aliens, I'm putting in air quotes because, again, that's determined by states. I don't think they have to have those because they can't get them. But to have the real ID, now they're going to impose that on the people seeking to purchase ammunition. That's not really equal protection under the law. So I don't think real ID is required across the board, but it's going to be required if you want to purchase ammo. The regulations were introduced on Monday in advance of a July 1st implementation of the state law mandating the presentation of identification when buying a pistol, rifle, and shotgun ammunition. So Second Amendment supporters say that it was the first notification that simply using a non-federally compliant ID would not be allowed. Many Californians have not visited the State Department of Motor Vehicles to apply for a new ID card or real ID. Jeff, it's like federalism doesn't even exist in here. This is just such a swamp. I mean, okay, so California wants to have their independence with regards to giving illegals, granting them driver's licenses. But if you are a gun owner, you have to go to the extra step of getting a federally compliant identification.
And I asked this of I'll give you his name, David Webb on Sirius Radio. I called his show because he was defending the the real ID, and I asked him where in the Constitution is the constitutional authority for the government to have a federal ID, and he potted me out and wouldn't let me talk again, and he pretty much just hung up on me because knew he's going to lose this argument, and that he's a staunch conservative, a word that means nothing. And, I still ask anyone out there, tell me where they have the authority for federal IDs, and I will eat crow. But it's not there. And to have now this, the state can do this. And in reality, and I think you've already said this, that California's constitution is pretty weak on protecting firearms owners.
They're not mentioned. Firearms.
Okay. Well, New York is the same way. It's completely out of their constitution. So, you know what? California, New York suck.
Yeah.
Move. You did.
Absolutely, predominantly over their political policies. Forget the fact that it's just completely overcrowded and the fact that I'd purchased firearms that were in compliance with California standards at the time. But as I said, you try to cooperate and work with them and compromise just a little bit. For instance, with the bullet button, that was deemed California compliant. Now they say that the bullet button has to be banned. This is what happens when you try to negotiate and compromise with these Marxists. It's best to just let them have their policies and stew in them. This is why decentralized immigration policies are what needs to happen, and get rid of the federal welfare, national welfare. We create this national magnet for the illegals to come here, but there's no fiscal responsibility for having open border policies among the states. If you stop that, and I mentioned this in my article, The Constitutional Solution to Immigration, then they have to be responsible for whom they invite in their states. And we're seeing the results of that in California right now, notwithstanding the federal Social Security and all the other benefits, Medicare benefits they get. So I don't see this.
Suzanne,
Yeah, go
before
ahead.
we move on from this subject, I want to just address one thing. All of our listeners out there, if any of you folks live in California, I'm going to offer you a solution. Number one, it's in your county, and I don't have this story in front of me, and I wish I'd got it, and I wish we were going here. I wish I knew we were going here. If your county should declare itself a gun free or a gun friendly zone, or whatever you want to call it, I don't care what you name it, and defy the state. And I'm going to tell you right now, start a secession movement, leave California, create your own state. There's the solution: decentralization. Get away from them, and that's how you fix the problem. Trying to change it in the state, never going to work. It's either move or leave. Not physically leave, but leave that governmental unit.
Well, and you mentioned secession, and I am a huge believer not just in secession at the state level and decentralizing and getting away from Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is perfectly legal pursuant to the Constitution as ratified. Do not fall into this Texas v. White or Lincoln settled it garbage. We're still operating. A friend of mine just posted something. It was a picture how 600,000 people died to end slavery. And I just said, no, they didn't. And somebody comments, care to expand on that? How do you just respond to that in a Facebook post? This is symptomatic of a systematic illness we have with our education system. Again, why would the government that arose to imminent power, unlimited authority over us, thanks to what Lincoln did, why would they teach the truth? Because if they absolutely taught the truth, what are they going to do? Give us the keys to free ourselves from the chains they've enslaved us all with. So I don't just complain, believe it or not, or grumble. I do have solutions, and Jeff alluded to one earlier: personal secession. If you don't like the state where you're living in, go to one that has laws more suited to your values. On another level, if you don't like the system being imposed upon you, for instance, and how to raise and educate your children, secede from that as well. When I had my two boys, I started, now as they're approaching age to go to school, Okay, let's start looking into the public school in my neighborhood. It's really cute. It has fresh paint, and I started doing some research and I realized, over half the kids, and again, this is not a racial issue at all. This was simple demographics. Test scores were horrible. Over half the kids didn't speak English. California uh, actually had a law. They passed a law that prevented, believe it or not, bilingual education in our education system. So now they have to focus on the kids who are challenged by the language. So again, when I asked the principal about this, I said, "Why are the test scores? Why are the students performing so badly?" He goes, I'm just I can only do the best with the students I have." And he was a great guy. I actually considered still taking my kids to that school. He ended up leaving. I looked in the private schools. We did that for a little bit, and I still saw the indoctrination in the private schools, the PC culture. So I just decided I'm going to homeschool. And I eschewed the requirements in California. You're supposed to register with the district, you're supposed to file and get essentially permission from the state. Didn't do that, nor did I in Utah. Apparently, here, this is a good article. This is out of the Herald, heraldextra.com. Utah counties homeschooling participation is skyrocketing. Now, this is going to be a three-part series, but I'm not going to go into all parts of it. But Justin Spears, who was on with us last week, and I think Monday, talking about decentralization of the education system, break this whole thing apart. We're actually going to continue, I believe, tomorrow, our discussion on homeschooling and unschooling in particular, something this article doesn't touch on, but it focuses on a gal that started her homeschool journey when she said she'd set up her public school classroom by putting items up on the wall. And she realized that her kids weren't getting anything out of it from what she'd put on the wall. She pulled her children out of public school to give them something different. She removed the posters and sat down with them, making building things and hands-on experiences with their kids. And they point out something in this article they really don't elaborate on. They just hit on it. But here's the thing, and I've discussed this with Connor Boyack out here from Libertas Institute. I've interviewed him before. He has a fantastic book called Passion Driven Education about unschooling. He said the main mistake parents make is they try to do in the school system at home. So you bring the books, you have that structured format, and the kids are going to be sitting around the table. In fact, Jeff, I'll tell you what, when I started researching homeschooling and I'd see the pictures of a mom sitting at the table with little girls, happily sitting there with their books and their pens and papers in front of them, I thought, wow, this is going to be really easy. Try doing that with boys. It doesn't work. And that's why institutionalized learning is so harmful to young boys. Boys need to be active. Kids are losing their recess time. They're suffering for it. They're in school longer. They have more homework. They're not sleeping as much. And then what do? They can't focus during the day. We drug them. So what they touch on here, but don't really hone in on, is the fact that because you're homeschooling, you do not have to do things the way they do in school. In fact, take the opportunity to do it completely different. And we're going to get into that on a different show. They get into the statistics here, and I'm not really going to get into that, but this is something that they said also in Utah. Again, you can read the article if you want the statistics for how many people, we'll put it's on my Suzanne Sherman's The Wasatch Report page. We'll put it over on CRN. It says here that in Utah, families must submit a signed and notarized. Your signature's just not good enough. Your word isn't good enough. You have to go to somebody the government chose and pay that person a fee to put a stamp on your signature, because you as an adult can't be trusted with your own judgment when it comes to raising and educating your own children. But I digress. So let me return to this. Families must submit a signed and notarized affidavit to their child's school district in order to homeschool their child. What does that mean? You need permission. Local school boards cannot require families to maintain attendance or instruction records in order to homeschool. Now, in California, they did. We had to sign an R4 affidavit, which had absolutely ridiculous, nonsensical requirements. I never filled one in, and they never knocked on my door, thank goodness. Parents can fully homeschool, they say, or have their children attend a public school part-time. Materials such as textbooks can be available to homeschoolers through district schools here in Utah. Now, when I first moved here, I did check out the Utah homeschooling regulations, and you were expected to teach the same amount of hours and the same curriculum as the public schools. Well, George Herbert did sign into law acknowledging the fact that when you homeschool, you don't need to spend as much time because you have much more focused attention on the kids, but you still have to teach the same stuff. So, needless to say, I never went to my district. I never got their permission. I sure as hell didn't go to any notary to tell them they could trust my signature. So, fortunately, now my youngest is 18, so I can talk about this, but I've had to kind of keep quiet on this because I really didn't want to knock on my door and have my kids or myself being punished, under any truancy laws. So, the public schools, one of the reasons these families are explaining here have delved into or gotten into homeschooling, and they said the topics in school that are being discussed. So we see this all the time. Sex education. We see this in California with the indoctrination now with the LGBTQ LMNOP curriculum requiring history from that perspective being foisted upon the students. And again, when you start talking about these behaviors and lifestyles, it necessarily implies, well, what does that mean? What does it mean when somebody has that lifestyle? And they're introducing this in kindergarten. They are sexualizing our children. And again, the political culture here, political correctness. She said that this woman was frustrated when her son came home with a gift card that said, Happy Winter. His teacher made him change it for Merry Christmas. I saw this in California too. Instead of Easter break, we had spring break. They had spring eggs because they had an Easter egg hunt, but nope, we're going to call them spring eggs. No more Christmas break. It's winter break. We're seeing that all the time. So homeschooling gives you the opportunity really to raise your children and educate them in a manner that is really going to fit in with your lifestyle. And this is something that every parent has, I would say, not only the opportunity, but the obligation to do. Yes, I said it. It's an obligation to get your kids out of these school systems, particularly if you claim to be a conservative. Jeff, is there anything conservative about the public education system?
Well, I know you're getting to an article a little later about conservatism, but again, I'll say it again. It means absolutely nothing. What are we conserving today? We're conserving our brand of Marxism. So, no, there's nothing conservative about the public school system. And you and I agree. Personal secession. This is one way for you to secede from the monster, the Leviathan.
And it's not easy. I know just parents will say, "Oh, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it." It's just that they don't have the patience to do it. Or my wife has to work, or we can't do it. You can downsize. You can also change your perspective. I learned a lot of things, Jeff, when I went on this primitive survival gathering. There was a gal that was speaking about self-doubt, and she just was very motivational. And she has a son that has and he was actually autistic. And she said after she got over the fact that he wasn't, the way she had planned and dealing with his struggles and the drama that they had, she just surrendered and just realized it was actually a privilege to serve this boy. Accept these challenges you have and embrace the kids you have. And one thing we're seeing in these schools too is, again, the relentless drugging with powerful psychotropic medications. We did a show with Dr. Marianne Block from the Block Institute. Just so show what
Suzanne,
yeah.
I don't want this to sound harsh, but I mean, it really comes down to priorities. What do you need? That new 5-bedroom McMansion or that new Escalade? Or is it, could you go with something less and actually homeschool, put your treasure where it belongs?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a priority.
There's nothing.
I don't want to be harsh.
No, and some people don't want to hear that, and some people, again, I've got friends that are doing a fantastic job with their kids in the public school system. But I will say this: they live in rural communities, small school, sense of community there. And even then they have to deal with teachers, again, teaching revisionist history. And even, by the way, if you buy your own curriculum and go elsewhere for it, you have to be very cognizant about the messages that are in them. I thought by going to a source called critical thinking, for instance, who doesn't want their kids to be critical thinkers, correct? And it was a critical thinker's approach to United States history. Well, they actually had the first question. Now, my son was 7 years old when I started this, talking about the history of abortion in Canada. So my 7-year-old at the time said, "What's abortion?" Are you freaking kidding me? I have to go into this discussion. So I called them and they said, "We're so sorry. We did not know that was in there. We will talk to the publisher." Well, don't you want to know what's in your books before you put them on your sites like that? So they were able to interject this into my kid's mind before he was possibly ready to cope with this scenario and this possibility. So he learned very early on that yes, people decide that they're going to kill their unborn babies and they make it a choice. And he was flabbergasted. I'm glad he took that position. And he hasn't changed from that, but nonetheless, this is what they're trying to instill in you. There's another one. It was actually from Scholastic. And I had this book. I think it was focused on some news show, but they're talking about the distributive property in mathematics. And we know that they have all these different kind of names for different things, but this distributive property, and it was a picture, an outline of a white girl throwing out money in the air to recipients holding out their hands and catching it, all of color. Now, you don't have to be a racist to really see what they're doing here. Okay. It's not racist to say, what are they trying to tell us here? They're trying to tell us that certain people here owe an obligation to redistribute their funds to other people. What did I say at the beginning of the show? What was the real bottom line from what I've been reading on the news and other sources of the Democrat platform here, and also Republican? From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This is everywhere. There are sources out there. I love the Tuttle Twins books by Connor Boyack. If you're a parent considering getting into this, read Passion Driven Education. Justin Spears and I are going to talk about unschooling. That is a mind blower for people. What do you mean you're going to let the kids pick and choose what they want to learn about? That's crazy. It's amazing. It is amazing, and you will have happy kids.
Every
So
kid is not the same. One
exactly.
kid might like science, one kid might like math, one may not like school at all, and maybe he needs to be pushed towards a trade. He needs to get the basic education, but push him towards trades. I mean, every kid's different. Why are we trying to pigeonhole them into one size fits all? Because what's that one size fits all? Government knows best.
Well, and how can we claim to celebrate diversity when we want all the kids in the same situation, learning the same things, all progressing at the same level? It doesn't seem to me to embrace the diverse culture we claim we care so much about. So you can't have it both ways. But the system is fundamentally flawed. It was created from the beginning in Prussia to generate a future generation of good factory workers. Common Core was created to generate a compliant future force to sit in cubicles and do the crap that they're going to do for them. So again, there's nothing liberating about an education. Speaking of education, when it comes to higher education as well, we've got all these celebrities paying to get their kids in these. You know what? It's only worth it. They're only paying this money because somebody thinks that these higher degrees from these special institutions are worth the price they're paying. And look at the garbage that they are turning out. But I digress. We could do a whole show based on that alone. But one of the things, a result of this malfeasance of the education system, I talk about the malfeasance of the legal education frequently, but in the education system and the media, is this, again, false understanding of what federalism really is. What federalism was intended to be, going back to the Constitution when it was debated, we had what they call the Federalists and the anti-Federalists. Again, words have meaning. The Federalists were really the nationalists. The anti-Federalists were really the Federalists. And what does that mean? Well, the Federalists wanted, in the name that they were using, a strong central government, really what we have now. The anti-federalists were really the federalists who wanted a system where a central government had limited delegated responsibilities and adequate resources to carry them out. That is the government that was consented to. And if you look now, how everybody has been hanging on these Supreme Court cases, we just discussed the one yesterday with the cross in Maryland, a World War II monument, where the Supreme Court justices went into this long, nauseatingly tedious dissertation of what the Establishment Clause means and how, yes, you little minions in Maryland, we're going to let you keep your little cross. They had no business even hearing this case, and this is the problem. We've got another one of these we're going to talk about today. Again, when your sources of information are ignorant, the people following them are going to be ignorant. Case in point, what is the favorite news source of the mainstream American conservative? Fox News. Gorsuch sides with liberals in shooting down tougher sentences for gun crimes. Just read from the article for a moment. President Trump's two Supreme Court picks, Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. Let me digress momentarily. That didn't take long, did it, Jeff? When Neil Gorsuch was giving his nominee acceptance speech, he said that it was the duty of the Supreme Court to defend liberty across the nation. Is that the case? Is it really their duty to defend liberty across the nation? Because that is pure incorporation doctrine, 14th Amendment crap that we fight all the time. And this is why everybody's waiting for bated breath to see what 9 justices are going to say when it comes to local matters like the cross I just mentioned. All right, let me get back to the story. They were on opposing sides on Monday in a case centering on whether a law that slaps harsher penalties on certain gun possession cases is unconstitutionally vague. The question should have been focused on whether the law in and of itself was unconstitutional, but that's not even mentioned. So Gorsuch sided with the liberals in a 5-4 decision in U.S. versus Davis, for which he wrote the opinion of the court. The law in question calls for longer sentences when a person uses a firearm in connection with a crime of violence, that's in quotes, which is defined as a felony that by its nature involves a substantial risk of physical force against the person or property of another and may be used in the course of committing the offense. Gorsuch said the definition's confusing. And we learn in law school, this is void for vagueness. Now, I remember when I was practicing law and one of the partners in the firm was taking me around, showing me the ropes in courts, and we were at a sentencing hearing, and he was showing me the state in this book and federal sentencing guidelines. Tell me, where is the constitutional authority for imposing federal sentencing guidelines on state penal code violations? Oh, but the supremacy clause. According to the Constitution as ratified, the general government has the authority to punish 3 crimes: piracy on the high seas, counterfeiting, and treason. So tell me where this law fits in to those 3 categories. Even the government admits that this language provides no reliable way to determine what offenses qualify as crimes of violence and is unconstitutionally vague, he wrote. Vague laws leave it to unelected attorneys and judges to determine what acts qualify as crimes. And it's really Congress's job to make that decision with the laws that they pass. It's really funny that you have a justice of the United States Supreme Court, which is notorious for legislating from the bench, all of a sudden now concerned that this is really within the purview of Congress. But never once does he even articulate the fact that under Article 1, Section 8, Congress had no authority to come up with the Hobbs Act in the first place. The Hobbs Act is actually a Title 18 United States Code 1951. It was passed, I believe, in 1946. And the intention was to combat racketeering and labor management disputes, and the statutes frequently used in connection with cases involving public corruption, commercial disputes, violent criminals, and street gangs. Again, where does the Constitution authorize the general government to deal with street gangs or labor unions or any of this? And these issues, just like the one I talked about yesterday with the cross, they go into all these elaborate analysis of the facts of the case without ever even addressing their authority. And the problem is, and this is what I said yesterday, you can call anything a constitutional question and boot it into federal court, and boom, there goes state sovereignty. There goes the 10th Amendment, which Thomas Jefferson said was the heart of the Constitution. So Maurice Davis and Andre Glover were convicted of robbery and conspiracy to commit robbery under the unconstitutional Hobbs Act. The Supreme Court's opinion referred to two recent cases where they struck down similar laws for being too vague. In those cases, when determining if a crime is qualified as a violent felony or a crime of violence, courts had to look at an ordinary case of such a crime as opposed to what happens. Once again, we have them just running off on a tangent that's completely irrelevant to the heart of the issue, which is their jurisdiction. This is just tantamount to, again, in the case I talked about yesterday with the cross, analyzing the test in Kurtz versus Lemon, which was, getting into what was this cross intended to do? Was the purpose secular? Was it an establishment or an infringement upon religion? Is there an excessive entanglement of government? Or Scalia and Heller defining what is the Second Amendment supposed to be about? What kind of guns does it protect? No, both of these are restrictions upon you in the black dress, you and your cohorts in the other two branches of government. This is a restriction upon you. Doesn't define what our rights are, because then what you do is say, well, your rights are subject to reasonable regulation, hence the bump stock ban. That's okay. Scalia said it only covered handguns. Now we've got the silencer ban coming on up. So Kavanaugh penned a scathing dissent where he was joined by the other conservatives. He warned of the repercussions the ruling would have. He said the court's decision today will make it harder to prosecute violent crimes in the future. The court's decision will mean that the thousands of inmates who committed violent gun crimes will be released far earlier than Congress specified when enacting this code. Again, where is their authority to enact it at all? Supreme Court doesn't seem to be concerned at all. So essentially, if you want to look at this from the conservative versus liberal side, Kavanaugh, the conservative, wants to put more people in jail and put more people in cages, and Gorsuch is a liberal for not wanting to do so. And this brings up an article, and I'm going to share this. It was actually came out in 2005, and it was published by the Mises Daily Articles, Mises.org. Love Mises. But this is what he says here, too. It's the intellectual incoherence of conservatism. We talk about this all the time. And what they say here is, under the influence of representative democracy and with the transformation of the U.S. and Europe into mass democracies from World War I, this is the crux here, right? Conservatism was transformed from an anti-egalitarian, aristocratic, anti-status ideological force into a movement of culturally conservative status, the right wing of the socialists and social democrats. Conservatives, drug war on terror. Conservatives, tough on crime. We're going to put you in jail for smoking a plant. But we also want limited government and freedom. You can't have both. You can't have both. So this case, again, getting back to it, the case is the latest in several where Kavanaugh and Gorsuch were at odds with the decisions. And again, this is the whole issue with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court should not be adjudicating issues over which the general government never had authority to make rules over and laws in the first place. This is the 10th Amendment. So again, by going in California and saying, hey, this ammo ban, that violates the Second Amendment, and we're going to call it a constitutional question, and go into federal court. And again, like I said, there goes state sovereignty. Comments, Jeff?
Well, no, I don't know. I don't think so. I think you got it all. Again, we are. We're looking for national, use the N-word, solutions for things that are state issues. And, well, we all know where that's going.
Well, there's a really good article here. And again, how this is a problem again with the Constitution. People say, well, the Constitution didn't fail. People fail the Constitution. But there are some articles written in there, and we've had Dave Benner on the show. He has a book called Compact of the Republic, and he's got a chapter in there, the sweeping clauses, the clauses that gave concern during the ratification era that said, we're concerned that these are going to give this general government more power than we ever intended. And that's really where we're getting this, because where is the constitutional authority for cases like this? They are using they're using for stuff like this, the Commerce Clause, because they say this stuff affects interstate commerce as well. I want to refer you to a case again regarding gun laws, and this is how ridiculous they can get, United States versus Lopez. And I'm going to get really, but as we wrap up the show, into an article by the 10th Amendment Center on the Commerce Clause as well. Also, if you want more information, the Founding Fathers Guide to the Constitution by Brian McClanahan. I'm actually going to link that up on my website as well, so you can order that through there. But United States versus Lopez ties into our conversation right now with regards to firearms, because it just shows how far the United States government, and to their credit, the Supreme Court, ruled against them on this case, on this application of the Commerce Clause, but how far they're willing to go to violate the state's authority over firearms and firearms policy under the auspices of the Commerce Clause. So Congress made it a federal crime. Again, that's not piracy on the high seas. It's not counterfeiting. It's not treason. But here's a federal crime: to possess a firearm in a school zone under the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. Thank God for that, Jeff. Otherwise, we might have had some school shootings since 1990, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. We need more government. There ought to be a law.
Here's what happened in this case, and I'm going to read to you from the page that analyzes this, but then I'm going to tell you exactly what the court was trying to, or what the government was saying here, what the U.S. attorneys were saying here. So a guy, Alfonso Lopez, was a senior in a high school. He possessed a concealed handgun in a school zone in Texas. This is a state. So here he is, has a gun in a school in Texas, and he's indicted under federal law. He challenged the indictment. The district court denied the motion, finding the act was the proper uses of Congress's, power under the Commerce Clause. This is what the Commerce Clause argument essentially said. Because children couldn't feel safe in schools if this law was enacted, and if the local governments didn't enforce it, kids wouldn't get as good of an education as they should, and therefore that would affect interstate commerce. I kid you not. It's as ridiculous as the Commerce Clause case of Wickard v. Filburn, where they said that an individual growing grain on their own property that would never leave their own property, never mind their state, the very act of growing your own grain would affect interstate commerce. Taken to its own ridiculousness, perhaps having my own backyard hens would affect interstate commerce. Perhaps growing my own tomatoes would affect interstate commerce. If you go by that argument, there is nothing they cannot control. I had a friend who had stem cell treatment. He had stem cell transplant because he has a form of cancer called multiple myeloma. They take out enough for 2 treatments. He's had 1 treatment. Now the federal government, after they harvest the only stem cells they'll ever be able to get out from him, we are taking authority over regulating your stem cells. Well, where do you get the authority for that? Well, the machines that are manufactured to do this cross state lines, therefore we have it. This is how ridiculous they get. So let me get to this article here with how can Congress get around the 10th Amendment and regulate almost every aspect of American life. And this is, again, just like the 14th Amendment, the Commerce Clause does the same thing. When we're studying for the bar exam, we are presented with hypothetical issues where we have to choose between the 10th Amendment and either the 14th Amendment or a Commerce Clause. And anytime you have to choose between the 10th Amendment and either of those, you always choose either the 14th Amendment or the Commerce Clause, depending on what the scenario is. They'll have one or the other on there. The Commerce Clause is taught to future lawyers as a means of rendering the 10th Amendment completely null and void. It's just there, not really doing anything. They claim the 10th Amendment doesn't apply because Congress is merely acting within the scope of its enumerated powers. But to make this claim, according to the article, one must assume that some of the enumerated powers are much broader than they really are, hence the term the sweeping clauses. One of the enumerated powers cited by the advocates of the modern monster state is the commerce power. And this derives primarily from two sources: the Constitution's grant of Congress to regulate commerce among the states, and we have the necessary and proper clause as well. And that was what Alexander Hamilton, as the Secretary of Treasury, used to justify a United States bank. Well, we have the power to coin money. This is necessary and proper. And this brings up our whole doctrine of implied powers, which, by the way, renders the Constitution effectively without any meaning whatsoever. I think was it John Taylor of Caroline who said a constitution without that was, I think, by implication, is like having no constitution at all. I mean, the English government had no written constitution, and what did they have? So everything Parliament came up with was constitutional. That's how we came up with parliamentary sovereignty. We've come full circle and returned to congressional general government sovereignty, if you go by what they're saying here. So again, according to the promoters of the monster state, the constitutional phrases go further than allowing Congress to regulate trade among the states. That's essentially, by the way, what the general government was intended to do: create a free trade zone, regulate and keep trade free among the states, and provide common defense in the event of an invasion or attack. That's it. Not to come up with these gun laws, not to come up with sentencing enhancements, not to come up with everything else they're doing, regulating wheat or food or the instruments of collecting stem cells for cancer patients. So they justify this behavior, and they make two arguments, according to the article. And this is a great article. We'll post it up here. I have it on one of mine already. The first argument was spun during the New Deal by University of Chicago law professor. I submit to you, I don't think anybody's done more harm to our advancement of liberty than law professors. Anyway, so the too many law professors spend entirely too much time fabricating constitutional theories to promote big government. The article says, yes, I confer. So this professor argued that during the founding era, the word commerce meant more than trade. Commerce included all gainful economic activities. Hence, Congress has a license to regulate the entire economy. If you use that definition, there is nothing this government can't regulate. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, really what it comes down to is you have to understand what they were talking about when this was written, and you have to go back to what they talked about. And the Commerce Clause is that they are to make commerce regular. And what did they discuss in the debates when they were talking in Philadelphia? They were talking about one state tariffing the goods of another state to get an unfair advantage over another state. So Congress was there to make commerce regular, and that's the Commerce Clause. It has nothing to do with an elastic. Well, they have made it an elastic clause to mean everything, just like you're talking about. And that's why I said all along, if Congress wanted to pass a health care measure that worked, they could pass a law that required every state to accept every healthcare insurance that is available in all 50 states. Because if you come to New York, there's only like 2, maybe 3 carriers that you can choose from. And I imagine in your state, it's the same way. There's probably only a couple because the state representatives there have got a payoff from those 3 or 4 people or companies, and that's all that's available. Now, to make commerce regular, there should a law from Congress that would be constitutional is every insurance carrier inside these United States is legal to be sold in every of one of these 50 states. That's making commerce regular.
Well, and this whole thing where you can have only certain carriers from every state. I mean, what are you supposed to do if you go travel? You go out of state and you get injured there. Oh, that's out of network. Then you have to pay more. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit more. But let me get back to how, again, we have how they justify this. So, a broader version of the theory that we just mentioned about regulating the entire economy was now here we have another law professor, this one from Yale. He maintains that the Commerce Clause means, and this is really draconian, any human interaction. The federal government can regulate anything so long as it doesn't trample on one of the specific guarantees in the Constitution, such as free speech. Well, that's interesting because the case that started us on this had to do with firearms. So, again, we're saying, well, the Commerce Clause means that you can pretty much regulate anything unless it's specifically prohibited in the Constitution, just like the Second Amendment. So they pick and choose what is going to grant them power and ignore what is really effective, is what's intended to be a limitation of their power. So the article continues, an even broader version of this theory was published. Oh, that was the Yale law. So on investigation, the claim that commerce meant all gainful activities or all interactions turns out to be completely untrue. It flies in the face of much about we know about the founding era, including specific representations by the leading founders that most regulations would be reserved to the states. Jeff, do you think if they were going to be subject to these sorts of interpretations, if the founders and ratifiers understood what was coming their way, they ever would have ratified the Constitution? I mean, it was barely ratified anyway.
Well, in his defense, Patrick Henry warned of all these things in his opposition at the ratification debates in Virginia. So did George Mason. And for that fact, so did Governor Clinton of New York. There was read the Anti-Federalists, the actual Federalists, and you'll find it there. They actually said all this.
They did, and their concerns were justified. So I'm going to finish up with this article here. It's sometimes necessary to prove the obvious. Several other academics have examined literally thousands of appearances of the word commerce in the historic records from the founding era. Again, don't look to what the Black Robe Messiahs say commerce means. Don't look to the Black Robe Messiahs to determine what the Second Amendment means or any of these issues before the court. Look to the founding era's debates, the ratification records. Those records show clearly that commerce in the Constitution, and back to our case here, means trade and associated activities, but no more. So the second argument they get into here for an almost unlimited commerce power is currently prevailing on the U.S. Supreme Court. Don't let anyone tell you that the court is conservative on such matters. The article says here, I agree. The argument acknowledges that when the founders wrote commerce, they meant only trade and a few allied activities, such as navigation. But it goes on to say modern economic life, unlike during the founding era, we get this all the time. You know, the situations change. So let's just forget this Article 5 and do what we need to do and modify the Constitution every time the Supreme Court gets together. We'll just have a little de facto constitutional convention and not bother inviting the states. So the modern economic life has changed. It's highly interdependent. So it is now necessary and proper for Congress to regulate everything that substantially affects commerce. I was actually talking to Mike Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center last night a little bit on Facebook. And, you know, he said it's amazing that the federal government even allows the states to exist at all. And I said, yeah, I think they just do it as a source for taxing the states and generating revenue. But he said here, going back to this article, the argument here about necessary and proper also ignores history. And you have to ignore history to go along with the traditional, or I should say the mainstream account for the legitimate role of government. Economic interdependence is nothing new. The promoters of the Constitution themselves emphasized it, but they also assured the public that interdependent or not, most activities would be regulated by the states. You know, they talk about things that weren't known at the time, and this is why we're going to amend the Constitution without inviting the states. I like to go back to the Migratory Bird Act. They said, well, in areas where the states are incapable of coming up with a solution, the feds are going to step in. I'm sure the founders were aware that birds migrated and crossed state lines. Folks, federal government has run amok. The only way to challenge this and not get bought in or sucked into this whole dog and pony show of national elections is to understand the proper role of the general government and how to keep it restrained. On behalf of those of us in the Cerberus Radio Network, I'm Suzanne Sherman. I want to thank you for listening and joining us today. God bless you. Have a great day.